think there's a lot of lessons that all the jurisdictions can learn from Europe, and it would be very interesting to get your thoughts, Trevor and Mark, in terms of what you think Europe have gotten right, maybe what they've gotten wrong, and just get a sense of how you see the sort of regulatory intervention in this space. Over to you guys.
Well, hello everybody from here in Brussels. A very wet and stormy and rainy day outside. It's a great honour and a great pleasure to be online with you all. I'm Trevor Soames, my colleague Mark English. We work very closely together on all sorts of cases. I mean, just in terms of the sorts of things we do, we have a lot of active cases against all the major digital companies. Some of these cases you'll have heard about: the Amazon buy box case, the data case. We've got the case against Microsoft in terms of tying. We are involved in Facebook. We're litigating against Facebook in the United Kingdom with a class action in relation to data. We've been involved in the Facebook marketplace case. So a whole variety of cases that we have involved in. We would not suggest that there are lessons to be learned from Europe. We're a completely different jurisdiction. And indeed, as was very powerfully stated by Raphael, which I thought was very convincing, the market circumstances, the political circumstances, the civil circumstances of each nation in Africa is very fundamentally different from what's going on here, and hence it's absolutely right and appropriate that competition enforcement should be linked to the public policy concerns of the relevant country. So, there are interesting things to look at as to what's been going on here, not just here in Brussels, but of course in the member states, or indeed a single strange country, which is no longer a member state, called the United Kingdom. So there's sort of interesting things. And also I think it's fair to say, I think would say this, that, until very recently, until the current administration under Joe Biden, with Cantor and, the changes at the FTC, the United States had been very, very far behind the European Union in terms of enforcement of abuse of dominance law and related matters in the digital high-tech space. And of course, in Europe, we have the GDPR, we have the recently adopted Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act. So there's been a huge amount of activity here. My colleague Mark will talk in more detail about what's going on, but there is a lot of activity. Now, what relevance these things have to the situation in Africa will be a matter for each jurisdiction to decide. But, it is very clear that it is of the highest priority to the European Commission, and indeed to the UK CMA, and generally around the world. This is why we have this call today, that digital markets are incredibly important in the economy that we have at the moment, not only in terms of economy, but also political. One of the great motivations behind the DMA, for example, was what happened with Cambridge Analytica and the misuse of Facebook personal data to advantage elections in the United States, and also, for that matter, we think very strongly, the referendum in the United Kingdom in relation to the European Union, which resulted in Brexit. This misuse of data has been looked at by the European Commission, national authorities, indeed the FTC, of course, which imposed a large fine on Facebook and remedies on Facebook, which it then proceeded to go off and ignore. So, there's a lot of activity. So coming from both the economic perspective, because of the importance of digital in the economy, and also, and this is the final point I'd make, is that, in these sorts of markets, the market can tip very, very, very quickly, so that it's a winner takes all situation. Where you have a winner in a market, digital market, where there are powerful network effects, you very rapidly find you're in a situation where that company dominates the market and really nobody can possibly compete with it effectively. And so at this point in time, I pass to Mark, if I may.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Trevor. And so, hello, everyone, by the way, and thank you very much for having us. What I have done is prepare just a few slides that provide essentially an overview of sort of the key sort of recent developments and issues that we're that we're facing in the EU and in sort of national countries and in neighbouring countries. I'd like to reiterate something that Trevor said, and it is absolutely not our intention to sort of lecture or give any lessons here. Nevertheless, I think it is probably true to say that on certain issues in this space, Europe is maybe further down the path of thinking about these things, and perhaps they have some solutions that would be appropriate in other jurisdictions. I think at the same time, I think one has the opportunity to learn from what the EU does wrong, as well as what it does right, and not fall into the same traps that they fall into. And obviously, in today's interconnected world, surely what happens in Europe will necessarily have some bearing on what certain large platforms do around the world, and surely in Africa also. So, with that said, I will attempt to share a few slides with you. If I can share my screen.
The green. You almost
share screen. Yeah, here we are.
Okay.
And here we are. So hopefully you can see my screen. And now this is a rather plain vanilla presentation, and sort of knowingly so, but I just wanted to essentially share with you what we think are the main sort of most important things that are happening to sort of help you, sort of guide you as you sort of observe what will surely happen in the coming months and years, and even what happened earlier today. And Trevor, by all means, do jump in if you want to add something.
I'm sure I won't.
Okay, so look, I'll start off with the big one, the Digital Markets Act. This is a piece of legislation, a regulation, in fact, even though they call it an act, that has been sort of in the works in the EU for many years, and we're finally getting to the end of that process. We have a near final text that will enter into force in the coming weeks and will be applicable sort of as from next year. The EC, the European Commission, will designate who they, what they consider to be gatekeepers during the course of next year, and compliance by those gatekeepers will be obligatory by early 2024. Now, we talk about gatekeepers and we talk about offering core platform services in the digital sector, but and we can have a long discussion about exactly what these things mean. But what we know really is that the intention is to regulate the large tech companies, whose names are already very well familiar to us. So I won't sort of bore you with the details of how these are defined, because I think we can be fairly confident about where we will end up in a year or so's time. Now, the DMA is, I think this is the one key point to note, it is a form of ex-ante regulation.
Yeah.
It is not sort of, as we sort of competition laws are used to thinking about, it's not ex post. We don't have things like effects analyses. We don't have pro-efficiency justification. This is, proper regulation with a series of bright line rules. Now, the aim of this is aimed squarely at the tech and the platform economy to improve fairness and contestability. And concerns things such as preventing self-preferencing by large platforms, encouraging interoperability, encouraging data portability, and sort of limiting automatic and pre-installation of various apps and platforms and services. Now, the European Commission is very much in charge of the implementation of the DMA and its enforcement. It has the power, or will have the power, to impose very, very significant fines. So there is the sort of fines of up to 10% of global revenue, which is very familiar from EU antitrust rules, but it goes further than that. In the case of repeated infringements, I believe that's 3 in 8 years, the Commission has the power to impose fines of up to 20% of global turnover, and ultimately even structural remedies. Now, and also, so that's the sort of the conduct. And also, gatekeepers, once they are designated, will be required to inform the EC of all sort of relevant M&A activity in that space. One thing to watch about the DMA is that it says a lot of things. It gives the Commission an awful lot of power. It imposes a lot of obligations, but nevertheless, there are inevitably gaps that will need to be filled over time. And in particular, there are many procedural gaps. So we wait to see really how this develops. I will move on because I know we only have so much time, to the next slide, which is the Digital Services Act, which is sort of the sister legislation of the Digital Markets Act, which is again expected to enter into force around the end of this year, start of next. Now, the goal of the Digital Services Act is very much different from the Digital Markets Act. The objective here is to implement a new framework of obligations to provide users be safe from illegal content, and protect their fundamental rights online. So this is really a piece of consumer protection legislation, which is there to complement the Digital Markets Act. And I won't say more. I just want you to know that it is there. It will be there very shortly. Another thing that I will speak to just very briefly is that we have had for a few years our very nice general data protection regulation. Again, it's not a piece of competition regulation. It is data protection. But obviously in this sort of the world that we live in now, the two are somewhat interconnected. All I want to say about this is that the legislation exists and it provides with a fairly robust set of protections for European consumers on how their data is handled, and it also provides teeth for fairly serious penalties in the event that companies do not respect the obligations of the GDPR. Moving on to merger control, so we're sort of back in the world of competition law. It's an area where we sort of seen quite a few developments pushed by sort of concerns about digital markets. Very recently, we've seen sort of on the substantive side, sort of the re-emergence, I would say, of various theories of harm that had taken a back seat perhaps sort of recently. We're seeing them coming back to the fore, most notably a vertical transaction that was prohibited a few days ago by the European Commission in the Illumina Grail transaction. Illumina will surely appeal this prohibition, so we'll see in the coming years how the Commission fares. Now, sort of jumping to the procedure, the Commission has been concerned that its revenue-based thresholds have been letting through sort of transactions that really the Commission should have reviewed, and in particular these sort of so-called killer acquisitions. So what the Commission did a year or so ago, it issued new guidance under an article of the merger regulation, Article 22, which is a provision that allows EU member states to refer transactions to the European Commission to review. Now, traditionally, the European Commission's position was that it would only accept and review transactions in which the referring member state was itself competent to review the transaction. So they would review cases where the national authority would hand over jurisdiction to the European Commission, and it would then take that forward. Now, in their revised guidelines, the Commission said, no, actually, what I will do now, I will keep doing that, but I will also take and assert jurisdiction over transactions where the referring member state did not itself have jurisdiction. So in a way, we can kind of create jurisdiction through the referral process where previously we did not have it. Now, this was controversial, to put it mildly. And it came to the fore again in the same Illumina Grail transaction, where the European Commission accepted jurisdiction to review a transaction where the merger thresholds, the revenue thresholds were not met, and indeed the target was not even active in Europe at the time of at the time of notification. Now, Illumina obviously disagreed, would rather that no one in the European Union review its transaction. It took the European Commission to court, saying that the Commission did not have jurisdiction to review. Put it very, very briefly, the European Commission won its case, Illumina lost, which is what allowed the Commission to then proceed to the prohibition decision that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, again, Illumina will surely appeal this decision, this judgment of the General Court, but for now, the European Commission's position on accepting Article 22 references, where the referring authority was not itself competent, stands and is good law, and we fully expect the European Commission to continue to accept references in such circumstances. In particular, sort of in the digital space and in transactions that it thinks are or could be these so-called killer acquisitions. So the Commission has now a tool at its disposal to assert jurisdiction over killer acquisitions that it did not have, let's say, a year or two ago, or that it did not at least use a year or two ago. The European Commission is also trying, and somewhat in a somewhat I'm sort of losing the word, but low-key manner. They're seeking to dust off old case law that pre-existed the existence of the merger regulation, which allows the Commission to use Article 102, so the rules on the abuse of the old Continental Can case law, which allows the Commission to basically call a merger an abuse of dominance under the abuse of dominance rules. Now, this is sort of law that's still out there. It's never been overruled, but it's sort of been gathering dust for the last few decades, ever since the merger regulation entered into force, and then the Commission had its own sort of lex specialis by which it could pull in mergers. Now, the Commission is, and I think one doesn't have to speculate too much, again, with an eye on killer acquisitions, attempting to allow itself to call sub-threshold transactions that have not been referred under Article 22 to investigate them as potential abuses of dominance. Now, I should state that the case that will, we think, determine this is pending. So this is very much an open question, and we will see in due course where we land on that. I'd like also just to say very briefly that we've seen sort of parallel developments in EU member states, and we'll touch on this later, but these developments have been done potentially through your more conventional sort of legislative process, rather than the sort of guidance, resurrecting old case law that the European Commission has adopted. And I think in truth, because they know that it's going to be difficult to amend, to go through the legislative process to amend the merger regulation. Okay, abuse of dominance. So in a sense, nothing new to report. It's the same tool, Article 102, and it's, the case law hasn't been ripped up, and it continues to evolve. Now, of course, the Commission has been and continues to be proactive in the digital space, investigating and from time to time making infringement decisions against, the well-known sort of tech companies and tech platforms. Now, European Commission decisions, at least infringement decisions, they are always subject to review by the EU courts, and the case law on abuse of dominance applies. And I've put on this slide a few of the recent developments. So you have the Intel saga, the allegedly anti-competitive rebates and exclusive dealing case, which after over 20 years goes on. And it's perhaps this sort of timescale that encouraged the Commission and the EU institutions to push forward with the promulgation of the Digital Markets Act that I talked about a few minutes ago. We have the Qualcomm judgment handed down on a couple of months ago, on which myself and my colleagues acted for Qualcomm. So we are very pleased that the Commission lost that case, and they haven't appealed. So that is a definitive judgment. I won't sort of do advocacy through through public speaking, but I think it's really a cautionary tale, which I think if you want to read a library of everything the Commission can and should do, everything an investigating authority can and should do, can do wrong, and how they can get called up on it by a reviewing court, I would suggest that you would find some interesting material in the Qualcomm judgment. And we have just this morning the Google Android judgment of the General Court, which Trevor is studying beside me. It's a very long and I think Trevor thinks rewarding read.
Maybe just to say just a couple of words on it actually. I think it does show a number of things. Firstly, that both the European Commission and the European Court are taking into account the way in which the digital economy may impact or change the way in which abuse of dominance law had been applied in the past. For example, I think this judgment, is very good in terms of the way in which it conducts a detailed and careful analysis of the markets and the way in which it looks at ecosystems, digital ecosystems. That's an unusual thing to find in a court judgment. It's something that people have been, including us, have been talking about quite a lot. Also, the tests that should be applied as regards whether somebody is dominant, where the product is being provided for free. So it's not possible to conduct a SNP test, but instead there are other alternative tests that may be considered, including qualitative tests, and that's something also that's being considered in this judgment. I think, apart from that, really, there are obviously some very interesting things that are relevant to our current cases, but I'd just like to sort of underline something that Mark said, which is absolutely right. The purpose of the DMA is to create ex ante regulation, the purpose of which, of course, is that, of course, I better get seen, the purpose of which is to try to stop misbehavior occurring, which would otherwise have required the regulatory agency to intervene. And these cases take lots of resources and can take many years to result in an impact on the market. So by engaging in ex ante prohibitions, one can stop things happening that would otherwise take a long time to deal with. And the way those things were identified, those issues that were identified in the DMA, resulted from a very extensive analysis that was conducted on behalf of the European Commission, all of which is publicly available, where different categories of behavior were looked at by the consultants and economists employed by the Commission to identify those that would be most beneficially dealt with via ex ante regulation. Meanwhile, of course, normal antitrust rules, Article 102, the national equivalents continue to apply and are being enforced, and it's a matter of the highest importance and political importance as well. So it's not just, as we said earlier, it's not just an economic issue, it's a public policy political issue as well. The power of these massive platforms, the ability of markets to tip, the impossibility of competition as a result, the winner takes all market, the loss of data, etc. So that's all I have to say. I pass back to you to conclude.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Trevor. And I think I'm just cognizant of the time. I think we have these slides which you're sort of welcome to read at your leisure and to take questions on. But I think just sort of cognizant of the time, I will sort of pause there and hand back to Mike.